the Talmud, and this should be in your handout, the sources from chapter 1, though this is, you can see it on your share screen. Rabbi Abba said in the name of Shmuel, for 3 years, Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel disagreed. These said the halakha is in accordance with our opinion, and these said, nope, it's in accordance with our opinion. And a divine voice emerged and proclaimed, both these and those are the words of the living God, but the halakha is in accordance with the opinion of Beit Hillel. Okay. So what do you think the Talmud means when it says that both opinions are the words of the living God? What does it mean? Both of them are the living God's opinion. Yeah, both opinions. Yes, Lou.
There is at least some truth in both statements.
Okay.
Perhaps another way to look at it is the old parable about the Torah is here on earth with us and not in the heavens. And so our giving voice to Torah is here. It's just another way of sharing that parable about it's not in the heavens, it's here with us.
Yes, yes. So because it's not in the heavens and it's here with us, it's by nature going to be partial.
They're both valid interpretations. However, one side wins to both.
Yes. Eventually you have to decide what the halakha is going to be.
Right. But they're giving credit to the losing side, saying you have a good point, but we're going the other way on this one.
Of course, there are different communities with different practices. And so sometimes one community follows one practice, a different community does it differently, but at least for each community, you have to have a set practice. You have to decide what the rule is going to be. Okay. So, do you believe this is actually possible, that they had a bat kol, a heavenly voice?
Maybe.
Who is they?
Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel.
The ancient sages in general.
Yes.
When they convened.
Yes.
They thought they did.
They said they did. Maybe they did.
Okay, but how many of you believe that, a bat kol came and told them exactly how to decide this?
Those who think so and those who don't are both right.
Thank you, Ann. But okay, so it's very, for most of us as moderns, we don't believe that these things get settled by a heavenly voice. How could we redefine that? Yeah, Carolyn.
I would say that perhaps by spinning it that there was a peaceful conclusion was the heavenly voice, that they came to an agreement, that some agreement to be able to come to a compromise is that heavenly inspiration.
And the these and those are just signs of respect for worthy opponents.
They took a vote and it was close, and then this one won.
Yeah.
I'm not sure what that gesture was, Steve.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah.
Oh, okay. All right. Sometimes in the chat, it's hard to tell whether it's thumbs up or thumbs down.
Yeah.
Okay.
I guess I like to think that there was much more of an awareness of God's presence, that it was an acceptable part of society at that time, and people did believe that God could speak to them.
Until they decided not to listen anymore, and then it never spoke again.
Until they decided that there wasn't any more. Right?
I think that's a really good point that Bernice made. But what is sort of unique about this statement, though, is that God is saying it's okay to see it different ways, whereas in other traditions, God says this is the one way, the truth, and the light, and that you have to believe it that way. God is actually saying you're supposed to understand two different points of view. That's a commandment almost.
Yeah.
Well, was God saying that, Daniel, or is that the way the dispute is being interpreted and resolved by the rabbis?
Well, Elijah said, he laughed and said, my children have won.
Yep, that's from Talmud, and those are all stories. They're, Rabbi, would they be Agadah?
Yes. Okay.
Okay, so that's what man.
Well, Agadah, I don't want to underestimate the power of a really good Agadah.
No, neither do I. But is it God's voice, like in Bill Cosby's Noah, saying, Noah, I want you to build an ark. What's an ark?
Mm-hmm.
Are you guys old enough to remember Bill Cosby's Noah story?
Well, I definitely am. But yeah, I mean, that was back when it was acceptable to quote Bill Cosby. So at any rate, yeah, I think we have evolved an approach to these things that we understand that diversity is also from heaven, just like Torah is from heaven. And we live with that. And that's our Agadah. That's our way of operating.
Instead of only having one meaning for each verse and who's going to find the right meaning, it's every verse has many things to teach us, and let's go for all of them. The more the merrier.
So we'll find some diversity of meaning here. Let me take a look. Let me show you the next text, and hopefully this will add something to our understanding. This is the continuation of the Talmudic text that we were just looking at. So, since both these and those are the words of the living God, why were Beit Hillel privileged to have the halakha established in accordance with their opinion? The reason is they were agreeable and forbearing, showing restraint when affronted, and they would teach both their own statements and the statements of Beit Shammai, and they would cite the statements of Beit Shammai before their own. Okay.
So everybody liked him. Respect.
Well, yeah, so there's the element of respect for the other side, and there's the element of even being willing to place the other side's arguments above your own, even when you don't agree with them. Yes, Lou. I'm sorry, Lou, and then Carolyn.
Did the entire Sanhedrin vote to try to arrive at a consensus, or was there a Supreme Court of some small number of sages that had the say?
I don't have a good answer for you, Lou, because it doesn't say in this piece which particular body made this decision. It may not have been a one-time decision by a particular body. It may have been an approach that evolved over time. It just doesn't tell us that. So, you know, the commentaries, they dispute about that. Yes, Carolyn.
Yeah, I think much like network news of today and the different, if you only get one side of any particular issue, you're not really making a case for either issue. You have to hear all the facts, and the fair approach I think that they're pointing out is that the House of Hillel was willing to show both and then discuss why theirs was the more desirable outcome. That you have to hear both sides to make an intelligent decision or argument.
Right, which includes both respect for the people on the other side and for their argument.
Right.
Okay, yes, Daniel.
I don't want to divert too much, but in twice now in what we're just reading, it refers to the living God, which strikes me as a kind of a confusing way to refer to God, as opposed to one that's, are they talking about the God of that time and we have a different God, or why living?
Let me try this as a way of dealing with your question, Daniel, which is a great question. What's the opposite of a living God?
I'm not sure if it's, I don't think it's a dead God. I think it's the God as he was perceived during the time of what this is written, and God may be saying something different now. That's the way I'm seeing it.
And the opposite of a living God is therefore God as God was understood in some previous generation. The living God is the God who is understood to be God today. Does that work?
You mean ever living, as in continually current?
No, I mean, obviously, the God of our belief is ever living. God is eternal, right? Okay. But our understanding of God is different in different times. That's all. Marcia, you wanted to say something?
Well, I was thinking of today in our Supreme Court and how some people are originalists based on the original Constitution versus other people who are willing to update their viewpoints with modern society. I think there's a parallel there.
There absolutely is a parallel. And, you know, you better believe that there are Jewish authorities who come down on one side or the other of that. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right? There are definitely people who make decisions in Jewish law on a much more originalist basis, although very few quite as literally as the originalists vis-a-vis American law. Mm-hmm. In that sense, you know, you're much more likely to find even people who are strongly traditional who accept the idea that, well, the living God says something different from what we understood in a previous time.
Right.
The Jewish law is a little bit older than U.S. law.
Just a little.
The bridge, a little longer bridge.
Is there anybody who still says that people who gather sticks on Shabbat should be stoned?
I don't think so. I mean, you know, you have a few extremists in Israel who, you know, will throw stones at people who drive on Shabbat, but not too many of them.
They'll throw them on Shabbat.
Yes, who throw them on Shabbat. You know, well, doesn't say anything about carrying out the stoning on Shabbat. Right? Bernice, you were going to say something a moment ago? No. All right. Somebody else? Thought I had some. Okay. So.
Ronnie has a question.
Yeah, please, Ronnie.
I've been thinking about what everyone is saying, and I think you need to look at it as history is sort of one era builds upon the others. It's kind of like stepping stones. And you can't completely dismiss what the sages said, 1,000 years ago. But we build upon that, incorporating what we now know, whatever century it is.
Right. The image that is frequently used in rabbinic discussions about this is the idea that we are not necessarily as great as the sages who came before us, but we stand on the shoulders of those sages.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Right? So, I'm not Maimonides, to state the obvious. Okay? Maimonides would be really old. I'm only a little old. However, right, because I stand on the shoulders of a bunch of other people, I look a lot taller than I really am.
That's because you've read those people.
Ah, well, sure. Okay, so it seems from some of this that dispute and debate and the recognition of the partial truths that we get from debate are central to Jewish thought. So, what's not clear out of that is whether that's an ideal or just a limitation that we have to live with. So on this subject, we have another video from Dr. Alan Middleman. And Jennifer, can you roll the next video?
So the question is, are debate and disagreement at the heart of Jewish theology? Is this an ideal, or is this just a lamentable consequence of our disputatious human nature? We might think as moderns, particularly living in a democratic society, that a culture of disagreement, everyone entitled to his or her own opinion, is an ideal. It expresses pluralism. It expresses liberty. It prizes individual opinion. The medieval interpreters of Judaism did not see it that way. They saw unanimity as the ideal, and they saw the culture of disagreement as a mark of cultural decline. It's because our institutions were no longer intact, because we didn't have political sovereignty, because we lived in exile, that we had all of these disagreements proliferating. The ideal was an intact tradition where you basically had a high level of consensus, even unanimity. So I think it's interesting to contrast a kind of medieval understanding of history as decline from a great perception and sort of unanimity about the nature of truth to the present sorry state, to contrast that medieval view with the more contemporary democratic view that sees disagreement as an ideal rather than simply the way things have to be. I do think that the rabbinic concept of a machloket, l'shem shemayim, of a disagreement for the sake of heaven, has tremendous value. And here I come down much more on the side of the moderns than the medievals, because I think some disagreements simply are permanent. There are fundamental choices that we have to make as thinkers, as philosophers, as theologians. And often the basic choices that we can make are equally well supported. There are equally good arguments on both sides. These are simply disagreements that cannot be bridged. And that in a religious setting is a machloket l'shem shemayim. So I think that does get at a kind of deep truth about the nature of the world. Whether this view and that contrary view are both the views of a living God, I can't say. But it seems to be, in terms of human epistemology, what it is that we can know, we get down to fundamental disagreements that cannot be resolved or bridged. So in a way, our culture of disagreement does take advantage of that, and does interpret that with some adequacy, not just with sadness or celebration.
Okay. Comments, reactions to all of this?
I have just a brief.
Yeah, Lou.
I find it odd that maybe not so much that Dr. Middleman would say this, but because I don't think it's him. I think it's what he's talking about. That in medieval times, they wanted a unanimity of decision as opposed to a discussion of disputes, when practically the entire Talmud is one of dispute.
Okay. So why do you think that this was so in the medieval period, that there was much more of a desire among rabbinic leadership for unanimity during that time?
Well, they were spread out. They didn't, they communicated only by letter, which took a long time. And it's hard to have a back and forth discussion by mail. So I think each rabbi of each area, each town, saw himself as the one to resolve the disputes, and there wasn't a Sanhedrin to go to.
Mm-hmm. Okay, that's one partial answer. I think there's another issue involved, and that is the more secure you are in your existence as a people, the more able you are to accept diverse opinions about the truth. And most Jews in the medieval period lived under extremely insecure circumstances. And thus, the need for unity among those diverse communities facing all sorts of problems. Somebody else had a hand up before. Was it Daniel? Yeah.
What little I know about the evolution of from Talmud to medieval to modern, I don't see this hump in the middle where they said, you know, that they disvalued disagreement. I think we've always done that from day one till the modern era. Where am I? Who was it that was leading a charge in the Middle Ages that said this is the only way Jews can think? I don't remember that happening.
Well, just the establishment of codes of Jewish law was an attempt to promote unity of practice. And there are three major codes of Jewish law. Okay, the first one was Maimonides, so that's 12th century, and the next one is the Arbaturim, the four pillars, written in about 14th century, and then the third one is the Shulchan Aruch, written 16th century. Therefore, you know, you have this is the medieval period. And that's when people felt the need to have and to study a code. I mean, you know, from our perspective, that may seem kind of strange because as I've often said, and some of you may have heard me say it in other classes, that when you, you know, as soon as someone writes a code, and publishes it. It's like the moment when you drive the new car off the lot, right? Because that's the moment when it depreciates the most. Because a code assumes that for every situation, there's an answer. But it's the Talmud that says, well, it depends on the circumstances. And maybe for different circumstances, the law will be different. But no, we need more unity rather than the diversity.
So were those codes accepted as the truth at the time, or did it take hundreds of years before any of them were made into codified codes, if you will?
Well, in reality, none of them was ever totally accepted by the Jewish community, right? So, you know, as soon as Rambam's Mishnah Torah came out, and again, you know, because they're not printed at this point, it takes a while for people to get hold of them, read them, study them. But as soon as they do, people start disagreeing with the Rambam and saying, well, he's wrong about this, he's wrong about that. What does he mean by that? You know? And the same thing happened, you know, the Arba Turim was not as influential as the other two, but it certainly had an audience and was accepted widely among European Jews, Ashkenazi Jews. And then the Shulchan Aruch, which had both Caro's Sephardi view and then the addition of Moshe Isserles, his comments from an Ashkenazi point of view. And so both of those were included in the Shulchan Aruch and saying, yeah, okay, so there are differences between the way Sephardim and Ashkenazim do things, but there's still unanimity about the law in a more general sense. So yeah, there's a fairly broad acceptance of these codes, even though, you know, as soon as they come out, people start arguing with them. But, you know, sometimes it's not that you say this is right, it's that this is the thing you choose to argue with, right? And thus it is extremely influential. Okay? Yes, Anne.
You're saying that if people feel more secure, they don't need a code? But only because they felt insecure, they needed a code? But the Catholic Church at that time felt very secure. Everybody in Europe was at least nominally Catholic. And yet they had, what do you call it, church law.
I am not an authority on church law.
No,
and
but it
certainly
existed.
not on the Catholic codes.
But they needed
all
codes
I
even
can
though they
say
were
for
secure.
sure, and all I can say for sure is I think this is how it worked for medieval Jews and why they needed a greater degree of certainty in that time than they did in the period of the Talmudists or than they do today.
Or the period of the Crusades.
Well, the period of the Crusades is a period of high insecurity, certainly for Ashkenazi Jews.
That's what I meant.
Yeah. Other comments, questions? Okay. So I want to go to the next text. This is number 11 in your handout. Okay. And what you're going to see here is that there were at least some sages in the period of the Mishnah and the Talmud who were not particularly tolerant of diverse opinions. So here it says, Rabbi Yossi taught that originally there were no arguments in Israel. I mean, you want to ask right at the outset, this is a Jewish group, are you sure? Right? Well, here's the evidence, he gives. A 71-member court sat in the chamber of hewn stone in the temple. Other courts of 23 existed in the cities of the land of Israel. I guess maybe they had court packing back then. And 2 courts of 3 apiece were in Jerusalem, one on the Temple Mount and one in Chayil. Chayil is just, it's deeper inside the fortification of the temple. So it's a slightly higher court than the one on the Temple Mount. When a court was needed, one would go to the court in one's own city. That's logical, right? But then there's a district court. If there was no court in one city, one would go to the court near one city. If the court had heard an oral tradition that would enable them to rule on the matter, they would tell him and they would make the ruling. If not, he and their most distinguished member would go to the court on the Temple Mount, right? So that's like the higher district court. If they had heard on a tradition on the matter in the court on the Temple Mount, they would tell him. And if not, he and their most distinguished member would go to the next highest court, the court in Chayil. If they had heard a tradition on the matter, they would tell him. If not, they would all come to the court in the chamber of hewn stone. That's the Supreme Court, right? Also within the temple. If they had heard a tradition on the matter, they would tell them, and if not, they would establish a quorum and take a roll. If the majority said impure, it is pure. If the majority said pure, it is pure. In other words, whatever the law was, they determined it, if there was no existing tradition about what the law was. From there, the halakha spread widely in Israel. When students of Shammai and Hillel who did not properly apprentice became great in number, dispute increased in Israel, and it became as though there were 2 Torahs. Comments or questions about this piece? Yes, Ronnie.
Who were the members of the court? How did you get to be a member of the court?
So, if you were a sage, if you were one of the knowledgeable rabbis, you moved up the ladder, right? If you were at the head of one court, then, when somebody else died, you got promoted to the next highest court.
But starting at the lowest level, who determined who were going to be the judges?
Yeah. So it varied from city to city, but it seems that there was not a formal framework for deciding who should be on the courts in each city at the lowest level. That the city itself sort of decided, okay, you 3 are the most knowledgeable in this town, right? They didn't have to all be rabbis, by the way. Depending on the size of the town, there might not be 3 rabbis in town, all right? But if they were the 3 most knowledgeable people in town, obviously if there was one rabbi, he had a little bit of pull with the others. Just like, if you're the chief justice, you have a certain amount of pull within the court at large, right? That's how it worked. And eventually, as you got to the higher courts, there was, kind of a gradual hierarchy. People became more recognized, and as they, if you were the head of one court, you might move up to the next court and be the low man on the totem pole in that court eventually.
Was this a position for life, or could you be removed?
Theoretically, you could be removed, but there wasn't a formal means of doing so unless the Sanhedrin would rule that, you know, that's it. This guy cannot, you know, he's excommunicated. He can no longer be one of the judges.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Other reactions, comments, questions? Yeah, Lou.
This talks about oral traditions that are brought before the court. And I know there were no books, and maybe there were some writings, but not a lot because of the way society was.
And also because it's the oral Torah, right? And until the time of the Mishnah, the oral Torah was not written down.
Not permitted?
Not permitted.
But people took notes quietly.
Maybe. It was an oral culture. You were supposed to remember it.
People memorized it.
That's right. That's right. And in fact, some people were prized not because they were great decisors of law, but because they had fabulous memories. And if you ask them, can you tell us all the teachings of Rabbi Yehoshua on this subject? They could just spout it out. You know, if it was 15 different things, they could just spout them out one after the other. They couldn't necessarily render a verdict on, you know, the quality of each of those teachings, but they could tell you what they were. Right? Yeah, Lou.
This had to be before the destruction of the Second Temple, right?
Well, it originated before the destruction of the temple, yes.
And the Mishnah was redacted in the 2nd century or the beginning of the 2nd century?
Correct. Mishnah is edited somewhere around the year 200. So yes,
so if
Mishnah,
there was
this describes a system that was still in place in the time when the temple existed up to the year 70.
If there was an issue and there was an oral tradition, my thought process tells me that there would have been only one interpretation of that oral tradition until this dispute came up. Assuming there was a dispute, but I guess if it came to the court, there would have been a dispute. So at that point, there would have had to have been an argument about what the different interpretation was. Is that what this is describing?
This could be describing something more, not just a matter of interpretation, but even about, you know, just what the law was supposed to be. Yeah. And to me, it seems that Rabbi Yossi believed that it was not a good idea to have these diverse opinions floating about. Right? That's problematic. So again, even though now Rabbi Yossi is, even though he is describing a time before the destruction of the temple, he is someone who lives after the destruction of the temple. So maybe he's reflecting the insecurity of his period. That is one possible way of looking at this. Okay. Yeah, Anne, I see you're trying to.
The guys who memorized, they would maybe be able to memorize both sides of the argument and recite, Rabbi this said da 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 da, and Rabbi that said da 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 da. They could recite the whole thing, both sides.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, Steve.
I think it was Daniel said at the beginning, I think there's a logistical issue also, because when you're so spread out at this time period, if different courts are rendering different opinions, you're getting too vigorous, and it's just logistically hard to have one body of agreement any longer. So that may have been part of what he was trying to come at, to say we need to kind of tamp down and try to be more unified to the extent that we can't just on a logistical practical purpose.
Yeah. Although Rabbi Yossi does live in a time when most Jews still live in the land of Israel. He's a relatively early Tana, one of the early teachers. So, you know, later on, yes, there's concern, and there might have been some concern even in his time about the developing community in Babylonia, right? Which ultimately became the center of Jewish life more and more. But, you know, it's hard to say exactly what, and, you know, I'm not enough of a scholar about Rabbi Yossi to be able to say what are the influences that really impacted him. I don't know. You know, maybe if I went back to Dr. Middleman, I could ask him that. Other comments or questions before we go on to the next text? All right, so let's go to number 12 in your handout. And this is from Maimonides. Oh, I've just messed up something here. Hold on. Let's try this again. Yeah. So here's from Maimonides' commentary on the Mishnah. Okay. Whenever two people are equal in their wisdom, knowledge, and understanding of the established rules of inference, in other words, how the rabbis interpret the Torah, a dispute will not arise between them when they apply those rules. And if it does, it will be minor, just as there was no dispute between Shammai and Hillel, except regarding specific isolated halachot. So you see what Maimonides is doing here is to minimize the differences between Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel. And this was because their views were close to one another in how they applied logical reasoning to the text. Both made their inferences by correctly applying the same hermeneutical rules. That's one of my favorite 25-cent words, hermeneutical, meaning the interpretation of text by certain logical rules. But when their disciples became less diligent in their learning, their powers of reasoning were weak in comparison to the reasoning of Shammai and Hillel, disputes arose among them, as each one issued legal rulings according to one's own wisdom and one's own limited understanding of the rules of inference. Yet they should not be blamed for this, for we cannot compel two scholars involved in an argument to do so with the wisdom of Joshua and Pinchas. Okay. So, according to Maimonides, why are these, you know, why do these disputes come about?
People weren't as smart as they used to be.
They're not as smart as they used to be. They weren't as careful as they used to be. Right?
Or maybe Maimonides thinks they're not as smart as him.
Well, that's probably true. I mean, Maimonides, you know, to be fair, was probably the smartest person in the room, any room that he was in, right? I mean, you're talking about someone who was kind of a triple PhD. He was the greatest scholar in Jewish law of his time. He was the greatest Jewish philosopher and maybe the greatest philosopher, period, of his time. And he was also one of the great physicians of his time, possibly the greatest. You know, you get hired to be the physician to the court of the Sultan, you know, that's a pretty good recommendation because the Sultan's usually going to go for the best. Okay. So Maimonides, yeah, you better believe he's the smartest person in the room. And So Maimonides, you know, humble though he might be in certain respects, is nonetheless aware that he knows more than most of the people in the room.
But other people disagreed with him anyway. But why does he mention?
Because they're Jewish, right?
Why does he mention Pinchas?
Pinchas.
Of all people.
Right. So I think that the juxtaposition of Joshua and Pinchas has to do with Joshua being the leader of the people, both a peace-loving person within the people, but also a military general leading the people at war as they conquered the land of Canaan, right? Whereas Pinchas, you know, he's, on the one hand, he's a Kohen, you know, he's one of the priests in the Mishkan, in the tabernacle in the wilderness. And he's also pretty impulsive in the way he decides, okay, you know, these two people in the sanctuary who are engaged in illicit activity, Zimri and Cosby, right? He decides to do the spear on them, right? So, you know, that was pretty much a spur of the moment thing on his part, right? So Yoshua and Pinchas, they are different personalities, but each with a certain amount of wisdom that goes into them. Okay. Ronnie, you wanted to say something? Never mind. Ronnie, if you want to say something, unmute yourself. Okay. Somebody else had a comment here. Okay.
I did actually thought,
yeah, Liz.
Would they, you know, talking about not as knowledgeable, were people just not educating themselves as much as they were at one point, or just felt like they're being lazy about just saying, oh, okay, this is the way it should be, but not having anything to back it up?
Yeah, it's not clear, Liz. You know, there is a doctrine that exists among the rabbis, and I'm not here to tell you that it's correct. It is. And that doctrine is the decline of the generations. The idea that the closer you are to Sinai, the greater the wisdom of the people who are making halachic decisions, right? So that, you know, yeah, even though I stand on the shoulders of those who have gone before me, I have less knowledge than they have and less authority than they have. It's very hard for someone to affect a change. And one of the stipulations is it has to be a court that is greater in both number and wisdom than the court that made the original decree. If you're going to overturn a law that was established by an earlier court, you have to have numbers and you have to have, you know, greater wisdom, however you measure that. But it's very hard to find that if you accept this doctrine of the decline of the generations. So that's a serious problem if you want to make changes in Jewish law and how you develop authority for that. Okay. Yes, Anne.
It is true that the people who lived a long time ago knew more about how they did things then.
Okay. Yeah, it is 11 o'clock. We need to take a break right now. Keep your questions in hand. And we'll start with questions next Sunday morning at 10.
Okay.
Thank you all very much.
Okay.
But
Thank
right
you.
now we
Okay.
have
For those of you who are coming back for a second hour class, 5 minutes.
do we sign out and in again?
Yeah, it's a different login, correct, Jennifer?
It's a different link. Yep.
Yep, good, okay. Everybody,
See you in
1, 2,
5.
3, leave meeting.